Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Let me get started so I don't use up my 15 minutes. The Ipsos affluence study has been, was also known as the Mendelssohn affluence study for years. It was first released in 1978 and has been published every year since. Throughout those years, a survey was conducted in a pretty similar fashion. It was a printed questionnaire mailed to an address-based sample, and it was used to obtain responses from affluent adults living in households with a certain threshold of income. Over the years, the minimum threshold changed, although the methodology remained fairly, or essentially the same. But just like every other syndicated survey, the affluence study was facing a number of obstacles: an increasingly complex media landscape that we were trying to measure, clients' desire for more and detailed information, increasing resistance from respondents to complete surveys that unfortunately resulted in lower and lower response rates. And eventually, because of all of these demands, the survey grew to 28 pages of very small type that, despite our best efforts, was visually unappealing. And yet, even with this increased number of pages, we still couldn't capture the details that the industry needed or wanted. So in looking at it and analyzing it, we knew that a slight refresh of the survey would not achieve the goals that we set out in order to provide clients with the insights that they needed. If we were going to thrive, we were going to need to dramatically change the way that we were conducting the survey. So we migrated, and we knew that we would have to migrate from this offline methodology to an online methodology in order to increase the visual appeal, to make the respondent instructions clearer so that we knew respondents were actually reporting back what we were asking them to do, to improve the survey's ability to reduce or eliminate bias due to position. Let me get to where I should be. There we are. And most importantly, to introduce cross-platform media measurement into the survey. The old paper survey relied on text alone to trigger a respondent's memory, but the move to online meant that we were able to introduce logos for all media brands, including publications, television networks, radio networks, and websites. The added memory device would help respondents recall and report their media behavior. We also instituted a screening mechanism for the first time in the survey's history and incorporated a triple randomization rotation in the survey so that it occurred at the media platform level, meaning that publications versus television versus websites were rotated, at the genre level, so within the platform, every genre had an equal opportunity to be first, second, last. And the position on the screen, whether they were in the upper left quadrant or in the middle or lower right quadrant. Before undertaking this pretty significant change in methodology, we conducted over 13,000 interviews across 9 test cells. In the spring of 2014, we conducted 4 test cells that were in parallel to our offline study. So we had a solid control group there. And these 4 test cells really formed the core principles of the new methodology moving forward. The remaining test cells in the fall of 2014 were really used to make final improvements or tweaks to the survey instrument before we went live. Now, given all of the changes, we knew that the design would incorporate a multitude of differences. And what we wanted to make sure were things like, would the move to online distort the population projection? And actually what had been happening in the offline mail questionnaire was that the constraints that we had placed on weighting prevented us from actually aligning directly with the US Census. So, for example, in 2014, we were underrepresenting younger African American, Hispanic, and Asian affluents, while older and richer affluents were overestimated compared to the US Census. The 2015 online survey, though, enabled us to align perfectly with the census. We also knew that moving to online would change audience levels for media brands, but to what degree? So thankfully, the test cell that took the best advantage of the online survey environment did show a strong correlation to the control cell, the offline study that had been conducted, yielding a correlation coefficient of 0.911. Now, there were some changes in media audiences and profiles, but the relationships between competitors remained fairly intact. As we looked at the coverage rank order within competitive sets throughout the survey, we saw some movement up and down, but overall the ranks remained fairly steady. And all of this was encouraging, but now the big question was, would we be able to replicate this? Would the media values and relationships hold up over time? To test this, we conducted a replica of the optimized test cell 3, 1 month later with a completely fresh sample. And the correlation of the screening levels that had been used between test cell 3 and 4 were extremely high, with a correlation coefficient of 0.991. And with 2 completed waves of actual fielding, we now see an even tighter correlation of 0.995. But thankfully, despite consistency, we also see that the survey is able to track some real changes that are happening in the marketplace. So for example, when we compare interviews conducted from January to March with those that were conducted in April to June, we see a fairly logical reflection of seasonal viewing. For television networks that cover general sports, the ratings between those 2 periods were relatively consistent. However, the ratings for sports networks that were devoted to seasonal sports saw changes that made sense with the time period in which we were doing the surveys. Baseball-focused MLB network actually saw its ratings double in the April to June period from the earlier period, which made sense since opening day was April 5th, and all of a sudden there was a lot more coverage or a lot more baseball games. On the flip side, we saw NFL Network drop 32% following the Super Bowl. I should note that things weren't always quite rosy during the testing period. So based on the number of media brands that we were compelled to measure, the task of completing the media section of the study took a long time. Clocking in at about 30 minutes, we felt compelled to shorten that test for the respondent's sake. So we split the media questions into 2 sections, a traditional screening to identify which brands the respondent might have connected with. And then after all of the media brands were screened, the respondent was shown a series of follow-up questions to gauge actual exposure. But the average respondent selected 49 brands out of the 381 that were included in the test. And that meant that they would have to get through 98 screens in order to complete the follow-up questions. We decided that cutting down on the number of screens would save them time and make the task easier. So to test this theory, we ran 2 more test cells where we combined media brands into single screens, cutting the number of screens by more than half. And surely this would make for happier respondents. But the results were actually quite counterintuitive. Frankly, respondents abandoned the survey in droves, and we could not understand why this would take place. We lost 60% more respondents with the shorter survey than we did with the longer survey. Our diagnostics show that condensing those easy-to-answer questions into single screens meant that the respondent would see the more difficult grid questions grid after grid after grid after grid, and the repetitive nature was just simply too much for them. So in the end, we made and tested slight modifications to the original way of thinking to the longer survey, and that proceeded fine, worked properly. Now, all of this means that we need to work on consistency wave to wave. So in order to maintain this, we developed a sample management system that would ensure week-to-week interviews were happening with similar types of people. We set up 18 different demographic quota groups that were using age, gender, and household income as the elements within or the variables within the quota groups. And then in the end, we used 15 different sample partners in order to make sure that we could reach as many different types of people within the organization. Since we're in field 48 weeks of the year, that meant we would have to monitor more than 10,000 quota groups over the course of the year. And thankfully, we have a system in-house that allows us or enables us to monitor them on a 24/7 basis to open and close quotas when necessary. So as you can all empathize and understand, each year our subscriber base requests more and more information be added to the survey. Very rarely does someone speak up and say, you can drop that question, or we don't need that information anymore. So given the number of questions that we need to cover, the study takes respondents, or would take respondents, more than 90 minutes to complete. We knew that no one in their right mind would do that in a single sitting. So the solution was clear. We needed to split the survey into multiple pieces. And what we did was we actually split the survey into 32 elements. The core survey, which is the initial questionnaire, really sets up the framework for ascription. It covers media, demographics, most of our future intention questions, psychographic questions, purchase behavior at a high level, and a number of other things that we would use to set up the framework for our ascription. In addition to those core questions, each respondent, is assigned 2 to 5 detailed product sections as part of the initial survey. 2 to 3 weeks after completing the initial survey, each respondent is recontacted to complete a survey that collects as much of the missing data as possible. And our goal was obviously to collect complete information from everyone and have no ascription, but unfortunately that doesn't happen. Where data was, for a respondent was missing, we employed a two-pronged approach to filling in missing data. We utilized a modified hot deck imputation incorporating 20 demographic variables in addition to that specific product information that we had captured in the core survey. And it was performed separately for each of the product modules, exchanging the variables to reflect what information was available for that individual on that detailed product question. Where the relationships were too difficult to establish, we performed a value prediction algorithm based on an ensemble of trees in order to predict the missing values. So this second approach was critical to our technology section, which is extremely detailed. As an example, for this respondent, in his initial survey, he completed the core section, which included questions on technology products that he currently owned and products he planned to purchase in the next 12 months. He had also been randomly assigned to complete the detailed product questions on travel and finance, but not the detailed technology module. So enter respondent B, who completed the same core survey elements, but also completed the detailed financial, travel, and technology modules. So by understanding the relationships between the modules and between the demographic groups, we were able to predict or build predictive models to fill in respondent A's missing technology detail. So right now, it was not an easy task to walk away from 38 years of history, but with the extensive testing behind us, we felt we were safe moving forward with the new design and delivered the first release to clients using this online data collection this past September. Our clients now have a single source cross-platform media for the affluent population of the US. The triple randomization of media brands among the other features has helped us to reduce some of the biases that are normally associated with position within a survey. The tightly controlled quota system has enabled us to reduce respondent weights, improving our sampling efficiency and producing a much better alignment with the US Census. And as we continue to move forward, we look for ways to incorporate passive measurement similar to what Pat was talking about just before, into the measurement in order to improve the ascription and making sure that the behavior is reflecting actual real market changes. So thank you very much.